Good morning, everyone. And if you're staying from the earlier service, welcome. If you are joining us on the live stream, I apologize that we're running a little bit late. The service this morning ran over just a little bit, and so it took us just a few extra minutes to get swapped over here. We are here in class number 19 of our study of the book of Exodus here. And I've already had, even though walking around the building, all anybody could see of me was my eyes, and I wasn't wearing my glasses most earlier. I already had several people just comment that I looked a little tired this morning, and that's definitely the truth. My anniversary is coming up here pretty quickly. Actually, this week will be our 27th anniversary. And my loving wife decided that this was going to be a good present for me. And so we went to pick out one and instead got two. And even though they helped me put together this lesson last night, sitting there right on my desk watching me, having two little 8-week-old puppies is kind of exhausting. They need to go out every couple hours. And when they decide to whine, there's no saying no to that. So if I'm a little bit tired this morning, a little bit slow, I do apologize for that. We are going to be in class number 19 here with the idea of getting to the covenant. I don't believe that we will quite get to the covenant today. In the past 4 classes, Sterling covered the 10 Commandments, and then Jay did a great overview of some of the various laws and how they would apply and why we should be studying them. But this morning I thought we would dig a little more into the text of those actual laws and so go back over some of that there and see how all of that ties together between the 10 Commandments and those laws. How does that work? So obviously if we're going to talk about the 10 Commandments here, one of the most well-known law codes in all of history, and Sterling did a fantastic job of digging into that in quite some detail. And I don't remember of him specifically mentioning it, but there is, of course, some question about are there 11, are there 14 commands, depending on how you would read that through there. I typically stay with the more traditional 10, with a slightly different changing of what the numbers are, perhaps. So I would say that, of course, the first commandment beginning there in verse 3, you shall have no other gods before me, where many people will say that the actual first commandment is not a commandment at all, just that original statement there. And that, I apologize if this is a little small on the screen there. In verses 4 through 6, obviously we have do not use idols or adultery of any kind. Verse 7, do not take the Lord's name in vain. Verses 8 through 11, keep the Sabbath. Verse 12, honor your father and mother. 13, do not murder. 14, do not commit adultery. Verse 15, do not steal. Then commandment 9, we would find in verse 16, do not bear false witness. And then this is again where the numbers will change depending on what some people will count individual commandments. We actually have 3 commands here in this do not covet. 3 things that we are told to not covet, and that sometimes people will count that as more than one, simply because there are some specific things listed there not to covet. But as Sterling did a great job in pointing out, these really tell us about some greater principles of God. They lay down some foundational principles for the rest of the Old Testament and even a lot of the New Testament learning. Almost all of these can be found repeated by Jesus in some way, shape, or form. So of course, just quickly, when God said, have no other gods before me, he's really describing his sovereignty, his ability to rule, his ability to be over all of the earth, over every single person. As he showed through his dominance over the Egyptian gods, and then the god of Amalek as they were coming through. He is the supreme being, the one who has power over everything else. And the children of Israel, especially at this time, should be having no other gods before him. Don't use idolatry, talks about God's nature, very physical, not very physical, more spiritual. We're not supposed to worship him associated with a physical icon. Don't use his name in vain, talking about his holiness, his specialness, not to be taken as something common there. Keeping the Sabbath, God is a unique provider of grace and a period of rest. Obviously, this is patterned after the days of creation, 6 days of work and 1 day of rest. Honor thy father and mother, the parent-child relationship, and how important that is, not only for us, but also to symbolize that relationship between God and his people. God is the God of life, not the God of death, and so he values life, and life is considered God's gift. And it is not up to me to take away something that was given to another by God there, so thus the command, do not murder. And just like the importance of that parent-child relationship, we have in the 7th commandment there, do not commit adultery, talking about the importance of that marriage relationship, not just, again, to us, but also to that symbolic representation of God's relationship with his people there. And also this talks a lot about this idea of sexual purity and how important that is to God there. Do not steal. We should be content with what God has given us. We should be willing to work and trust in God to provide, not try to take it from someone else. Don't bear false witness, the importance of truth and justice. And then, of course, do not covet. Really, this is kind of very similar to the do not steal kind of idea, where this really takes it one step forward. It's not so much that I want what that person has. The idea of coveting really involves, I want that to the point that I don't want you to have it either. Not just I'm happy if I got one too, but I'm coveting what you have, that you were blessed in some other way, and so I feel I'm more important than you. And a lot of scholars will really emphasize here that the opposite of that covenant, of coveting, not covenant, the opposite of coveting something is being happy for someone who has those blessings and being able to put them and their needs and their desires first here. Then in the next several chapters, we do get into these various laws. And before we read some of these, and I do want to read a portion of that today, depending on how much time we have left as we go through here. But just some overall comments I wanted to make about these various laws in general. The first thing is that these are really extensions of the 10 Commandments. Every single one of the 10 Commandments is going to find a home or a root in the next 2.5 chapters. All of those laws are based somewhat in the principles and the outlines that we find there in the 10 Commandments. And sometimes we will see some very detailed examples of those principles, but we should not take that this was intended to be some kind of exhaustive list that controls every single specific situation in life. For example, one of the laws that we'll read is this idea about if a bull gores someone, what happens? And if that person is injured or if that person dies, what happens to, or if that bull gores another animal? It seems to be there's a whole lot of details here that would seem like God is trying to outline every single aspect of that person's life. But there's no mention of any other animal. What if a ram, maybe not gores, but headbutts someone and kills them? What if your dog attacks somebody? Okay, all kinds of different situations that the law doesn't cover exhaustively here. God is laying down principles that are then going to be guidelines for the people and for the judges in order for them to appropriately judge the situation and see that God's will is done there. And of course, I think it's important for us to realize that what we have in the book of Exodus is not complete. It's not a complete recording of all of the laws that Moses was given, of even all of the laws that he spoke to the people. We'll find when we study on Wednesday that it even says that there's a lot more things that he said that we don't have exactly written down here. Very similar to in the book of John, where it says there's no way it could contain all of Jesus' teaching. It's the same thing here. They didn't write down in the Pentateuch, in the book of Exodus, one of those 5 books, they did not write down every single law that was given. There were books and books and books of laws, and that became even bigger over time as they added to that with rabbinical teachings. And just like we would say our laws started with the Constitution, and since then, how many laws do we have? I don't even know if it's countable, right? Same thing happened in Israel. Over time, the number of laws they had continued to grow as the nation matured there. So just important things for us to remember about that. Also, the purpose of the law here is to teach man accountability. When we look at all of these laws, they talk about your actions have consequences. Some of those are going to be very severe. We're going to see capital offenses right away, how some things are going to be punishable by death. It's also interesting to note that even all the way back here in the law, which we tend to think of being very controlling, do not do this, it even talks about the failure to act being equally important here. Not just are you required to do this, but if you don't live up to the standards set forth by these principles, you're also going to be held accountable for your inaction. And we'll see some of that even today. Another thing that the law is meant to teach, that these laws specifically are meant to teach man, is that payment must be made for transgression. It's going to talk about several different kinds of payments that can be made here. Payments, some determined by a judge, some specifically determined by the law. A specific number of shekels are spelled out here in some of these verses. There's always a payment that needs to be made for transgression. And the thing about justice is not gracious. True justice is not gracious. You get what you earn. What's the most common passage that people quote every single day that is going to be in this today here that would be just the epitome of justice, but in which there is no grace whatsoever? Eye for an eye, that's right. Eye for an eye. You do something that causes somebody's eye to be lost in functionality or pop out or whatever. Guess what justice calls for? Your own eye to be put out. That's justice. That is not grace. And true, complete justice is not gracious here. An important lesson for man to learn. Also, is meant to teach us that man is supposed to have responsibility, not just in what we do for ourselves, but how we care for others. And the things and how we treat other people is sometimes even more important than the things that we would do for ourselves. Even when it comes down to property, the property that you are given, you are called to care for it in a certain way, to watch out for it, and to accept responsibility for that property as a steward of God's gift. God has seen fit to give you this property. It is now your responsibility to take care of that. This goes all the way back to one of the first commandments that, not even spelled out as a commandment, but just implied there. When Adam and Eve were in the garden, they were given all of this great, wonderful place to live, and food was pretty much just go pick it, and it was there. But yet, what were they still told to do? They had to tend it and manage it. They had responsibility. So even going all the way back here, all of God's laws are going to teach us about that responsibility. Another thing that I want to make a comment about any of the laws and the things that we read here in the book of Exodus, remember, it's important to understand that God was making laws that were applicable to the world as it was. Okay? It is not always spelling out an ideal situation, but God is reacting to things that were prevalent in the world. Take, for example, this idea of slavery. Did slavery exist? Yes. In fact, the entire nation of Israel just did what? They just escaped from slavery. But interestingly enough, even at this time, slaves were able to have what? Other slaves, okay? So even though they were just rescued from slavery, they already have slaves themselves, and so God is going to address how you take care of them, how you act toward them, even though that may not be God's original design or the way that he would have wanted his people to act, but yet he's going to set laws that deal with what was already going on. Again, of course, how godly people should act anyway in those scenarios. And then the last thing I'll say about this in a general context here is some of these laws simply make no sense to us. Because we don't have the right context for what that law means. I think the best example we have of this is in chapter 23 and verse 19. And let's turn over there and read that quickly here. So 23 in verse 19, this is, of course, after it's talking about the feasts and things like that, which we'll get into much more detail, but listen to this. The best of the first fruits of your ground you shall bring into the house of the Lord your God. Oh, that's pretty simple. You shall not boil a young goat in its mother's milk. What? Well, what does that mean? You shall not boil a young goat in its mother's milk. How do you even do that? Over the years, perhaps the most common description of this is that this was a practice that was done in Egypt, that as part of magic and part of the worship of some of the Egyptian gods, that as they got toward the end of the season, one of the things they would do is they would take a young lamb and they would boil it in its own mother's milk as some kind of symbolic gesture, and then either eat that, or some people claim they would then take that out and spread it as fertilizer, some kind of magic spell. That's just kind of the default explanation people have taken over the years. I have never in my study, and I've tried pretty exhaustively, to find any evidence of that kind of behavior. No other place is it ever mentioned in any kind of outside of the Bible passage that this happened. It's also just as likely that this was some kind of idiom that we don't have any kind of clue what it means because it just doesn't make sense to me. In my study, I ran across a guy who was giving some examples of that I found pretty striking. If I said to you, well, that guy was just a flash in the pan, today, what would you think that meant? Well, they sparked to success very quickly, but really nothing came of it, right? Pretty common, we all understand what flash in a pan means. But do you realize that it really wasn't that long ago, only 200 years, that what that phrase really came from was in a flintlock rifle, when you would pull the trigger and you would get a spark in the pan, but yet it would not ignite the entire barrel and actually shoot the bullet. That's where that phrase comes from. But almost nobody knows that today. We use it completely differently. Another example, think about if I came to you as a motorcycle guy and said, I rode my hog to Target. Does everybody here understand what I meant? Sure. But 2,000 years from now, or 4,000 years from now, if someone said, well, Scott Logan said in the lesson he rode his hog to Target, what are you going to think that means? Riding on some pig to hit some kind of target, maybe some kind of jousting event? I don't know. You're not going to understand what that means. Another one is a motorcycle rider. I heard the other day, I didn't even get this. One of the guys that I'm friends with was talking about his trip back from Texas and said he'd just spent 12 hours in a cage. It's like, what? What? Well, in his context, that spending 12 hours in a car and wrapped in the steel is like spending it in a cage as opposed to being on your motorcycle and riding. And within certain circles, that's a very well-known idiom. But if you didn't know that, what would you think that meant? Well, for some hour, he was locked up in prison for 12 hours, or why was he in a cage? So we're going to see some phrases in these laws that, quite honestly, we don't have any idea what they mean. Even Jewish scholars and rabbinical experts would argue, what does this mean? Where did it come from? because just over time, that phrase, nobody knows why it was there. Nobody knows what it was put in there for. But did the people who it was written to, did they know? Absolutely, they understood. And actually, we find that phrase, don't boil a young goat in its mother's milk, 3 times in the Bible, all in reference to around this time of the feasts and things. But again, it doesn't, in any one of the passages, doesn't give us any clear detail about what that might mean or might not mean. Just a quick, before I keep going here. Scott, what time am I supposed to be done? 10:25, 10:20? 10:25? Okay, so I've got 20 minutes left, okay. Just wanted to make sure. So let's go ahead and look at some of these laws then, and what they mean, and how we can tie these back to the 10 Commandments, because I think that's a pretty important thing to go through and look at here. What the purpose of these laws were, what was some of the foundational principles that were put down. I think we probably won't read as much as I had intended just because we're running out of time here. But just as an example, let's go ahead and read the rest of chapter 20. So of course, chapter 20 is where the 10 Commandments were given, and you get all the way down to verse 21, and it's the end of the 10 Commandments being given, God actually speaking from the mountain, and of course the people saying, don't let God do that anymore. Moses, you tell us the laws and we'll listen, because if God keeps this up, he's going to kill us. We're going to die. So immediately we get into some of these various laws, and I just thought we might read these as an example here. And the Lord said to Moses, thus you shall say to the people of Israel, you have seen for yourselves that I have talked with you from heaven. You shall not make gods of silver to be with me, nor shall you make for yourself gods of gold. An altar of earth shall you make for me, and sacrifice on it your burnt offerings and your peace offerings, your sheep and your oxen. In every place where I cause my name to be remembered, I will come to you and bless you. If you make me an altar of stone, you shall not build it of hewn stones, for if you wield your tool on it, you will profane it. And you shall not go up by steps to my altar, that your nakedness be not exposed on this. So some pretty clear teachings here about how to make an altar, what you're not supposed to do here. We get a little bit of a confusion perhaps on that verse 26 about not making steps that would go up to the altar, how that would expose your nakedness. Again, just because we don't wear what that they wore all the time? Robes, that's right. We don't wear robes, and even if we did wear robes, we would probably have a lot of undergarments underneath them, as opposed to where they would not have. So that idea of stepping up on steps to climb up to an altar could expose you to that, and so God says don't do that here. But this is pretty self-explanatory, pretty easy, but yet I think it is important that we realize, where is the root of these from? From those 10 Commandments, right? So if we were to talk here in chapter 20, verse 23, it says, make no gods of silver to be with me, meaning no other gods with me. And by the way, don't make any gods of gold for yourselves, meaning representations of me in gold. So both the first and second commandments are basically repeated here, just flushed out in some more detail. Don't have any other gods, and don't use idolatry here. Even when that would carry forward to the idea of altars. The altars are supposed to be of natural make. You're not supposed to use, it's supposed to be just of earth. Just make an altar out of the earth there, maybe dig it up, pile it up. Or if you're going to use stones, definitely don't do what with the stones? Don't cut them and square them and make this nice block. Because what could happen? You then are fashioning a representation for God. Don't do that. God is not supposed to be represented in that way, okay? Now, of course, we're going to see in a couple classes the idea of the main altar, okay? They're going to work it, and it's going to be very different. It's not going to be made of earth or of stone, but yet that's going to be different than the individual people here and the altars that they are commanded to make. So again, just the principle that many of these laws are following through with the principles that were expressed in the Ten Commandments there. I don't want to read the entire section here of 21, where we would get into all of these laws about the slaves. We'll just read a little bit of that here. Just the first 2 verses even. Now these are the rules that you shall set before them. When you buy a Hebrew slave, he shall serve 6 years, and in the 7th he shall go out free for nothing. What does that sound an awful lot like? The Sabbath, right? 6 days of work, 6 years of work, and what happens on the 7th? You're granted rest. You're granted grace from that, okay? So even in this idea that if you do have a slave, you can only keep that slave for 6 years because that's the period of work. After that, that slave is going to get the same grace, the same kind of freedom and rest that I'm giving you as my people. Again, this idea of a law, one of the 10 Commandments being carried forward. Now, of course, we can read through the rest of those laws, and it talks about if you become a slave as a single man, when you leave as a single man. If you come in married with children, you go out married with children, okay? Part of that same grace. But you can choose, if you decide that you would want to choose, you can stay a servant, stay a slave to your master, and they can pierce your ear. We sing that song, "Pierce My Ear," because you are symbolizing, I'm happy where I'm at. I don't need freedom. I'm happy to stay right here. And it goes through some of those details there. So in 21 verses 3 through 6, we see some of the details of how a married slave is supposed to be treated. And again, and a single slave. So how male slaves are going to be treated here covers, again, both 5 and 6. Honor your father and mother. The idea of if I have a child, that child is mine, doesn't belong to anyone else. And so if I leave slavery, that child comes with me. Same thing true with the idea of a wife and marriage, holding that responsible. So again, command 7, do not commit adultery, and holding that. Same thing is true of female slaves. There's a slightly different rule here. If you take a female slave, you're not supposed to just take that woman and abuse her. That woman is supposed to become your wife. Or if you take that woman as a slave to be a wife for your son, then she gets treated as a daughter. And all kinds of rules about, even if you decide that it's not going to work out, well, then she gets redeemed for free. She doesn't have to pay back the bride price because you treated her wrongly. All of these kind of things that really go against what would have been the common practice for slavery then, which is once you're in slavery, what? You're completely owned. There's no grace. There's no forgiveness there. Throughout the rest of this chapter, in chapter 1, then, we start to find a lot of these laws that will start to explain what is punishable by capital offense, what is not. Verses 12 through 14, murder is a capital offense. Does that go one of the 10 Commandments? Thou shalt not murder, right? And it even defines and goes into more detail here. But what happens if you strike a man but he doesn't die? Or it's different if you guys were just he came into your hands, you were fighting, something happened, versus did you lay in wait and intend to take his life? The law treats it separately. Again, there's actions and consequences. And this idea that murder is a capital offense just goes right along with that the 6th commandment, thou shalt not murder. It's also a capital offense to even strike your parents. Okay, so someone who strikes their parents, obviously the 5th commandment, honor your father and mother, carried forward there. Stealing a man is a capital offense. If you would take a man, capture him, and sell him into slavery, you are taking away the freedom that he had. That is a capital offense. Again, that's almost the same as murder. That man's life, which was free, given to him by God, you are taken away. Cursing parents is also a capital offense. I'm glad it's not that way today. I probably wouldn't be here in front of you. Some of the consequences of stealing we see here in chapter 22, verses 1 through 4. If you're caught coming in, then you get killed. Guess what? You were told not to steal. If they catch you, but you make it all the way till morning, meaning you weren't intending to hurt anybody, well, then you just got to pay for everything that you were trying to take. And we're not going to go into all of these details, but just again highlighting that they are extensions of those 10 commandments there. Continuing there in chapter 22, we have about 11 verses that cover this idea of ownership and compensation. If I own a piece of property and something you or something you own damages that property, I need to be compensated. If I lend you something and something happens to it while it's in your possession, I'm to be compensated. All kinds of rules around there. In verses 16 and 17, there's a price to be paid for premarital sex. Okay, what that price is going to be, again, while we would typically think of adultery highlighting that already married relationship, again, this just goes to show how serious God takes that sexual relationship within marriage, that even before then, he would cover that. Sorcery being a capital offense, using any kind of magic or worship of another god to try to accomplish your goals instead of asking God for things what you want. Having sex with animals is a capital offense. Again, talking about that sexual purity kind of law there. Don't oppress the sojourner, the traveler who's along you. Don't take advantage of them. Don't oppress them because you also were a sojourner. Again, that idea of taking care of someone else there. Treatment of widows and orphans is caused. Rules for lending. One of the big things about lending is, what are you trying not to do? Take advantage of your brother who needs something, right? Even to the point of, if he needs something from you, don't take his surety, his cloak, because if something happens, what's he going to sleep in? What kind of care am I showing for my brother if all I'm going to do is try to take absolutely everything that he has? The goal of lending should not be for me to gain. The goal of lending should be what? To help my brother. Okay? Don't revile God or the rulers that he has set up. Then we get into chapter 23. There's no false witness or mistreating the poor. Again, going directly against commandment number 9. Then we see in verses 4 and 5, what are you supposed to do if you see someone else's animal in trouble, or if that person's having problems with their animal? Even it says your enemy is having problems. Are you supposed to just walk away? No. You're supposed to help that person out, even if they are your enemy. Again, that idea of wanting the best for your brother, for doing those kind of things. Then we get into the rest of 23. There's a pretty extended little section here, again talking about false witnesses or mistreating the poor. Again, this idea of don't be pressured, right? If there's a group of people who are trying to lie and trying to misrepresent things in order to get their way, don't go along with them. You stand up for what's true and for what's right. Do the things that are going to be the truth there. Also, we see this first time, even though Moses was told by his father-in-law, the men that you pick in order to help you, don't find people who love a bribe because it's going to cause you problems. That now comes into the law here. Judges especially don't take bribes, but when it comes to the idea of, are you going to be someone who's going to give true witness or give false witness, don't let someone buy your testimony, because that just gives way to not caring for your brother there. Again, this idea of don't suppress the sojourner is repeated. We see then this idea of the Sabbath is going to be represented now, not just for people, but also for the land. 6 years you can work a field, but the 7th year, what do you have to do to that field? You have to let it rest. You have to let it go fallow. Now, does that mean that there aren't still going to be plants that grow there? I mean, all you have to do is look around here. If I plant corn in a field for 6 years, what's going to happen if I don't do anything that 7th year? There's going to be some corn grow there. What are they supposed to do with that? They leave it, right? They leave it for the poor. That's the grace. Just like God is showing us grace on the seventh day, we on the seventh year show grace to everybody through the use of that land. Chapter 23, verse 23 directly talks about don't even speak the names of other gods. And then the rest of that section there, verses 16 through 19, where it's covering those ideas of the feasts and going through there and, the feast of unleavened bread, which is really the feast of Passover, right? Passover is the culmination of that feast there. And then the feast of first fruits and the feast of the ingathering once the harvest is completed. So at the beginning of harvest and at the end of harvest, again, talking about this idea of there's going to be this period of work, but then there's going to be a rest and a feast at the end of that. So there's a lot of detail here in these laws that we're not going to dig into much more detail, but I did want to try to spend some more time in the text and trying to understand why we see these laws here. I mean, after all, if God only gave us, recorded in the book of Exodus, is what Moses was writing down here, was only a portion of what he presented, well, why were we given this portion? Why not some other portion? Well, these are the laws that are providing us with that example. God gave us the principles in the Ten Commandments, and now here's some real-world application of how, as a people, you're going to take those principles and implement them in your daily life, and how you're going to deal with situations that are going to arise when people don't live by those principles, even to the point of what's a capital offense, what can be paid for by money, what's going to be paid for by property. One of the laws, we didn't read specifically, but that idea, if I have an animal that gores one of your animals, well, now we share both the dead animal and the live animal. We share that, okay? But if I knew, as the owner of the animal that gored, if I knew that animal was prone to attack and prone to kill other animals, and I did nothing to stop that, then what? Again, I'm responsible for my inaction, right? So now I'm wholly responsible for that, and I have to completely provide compensation to the guy who had an animal killed. All right, I wanted to take just some time this morning before we get into actually talking about the covenant, which will be on Wednesday. We'll look at some of the details of the covenant, what it meant, why this covenant is an example for us moving forward. I mean, after all, the new covenant that we're under, we have to understand the old covenant, how it was made, what happened, events during that time. We're going to be covering that on Wednesday there. Were there any questions or anything? I know we're low in number and kind of spread out here. Any questions anybody had or comments about any of the specific laws here? That's something that you thought was strange or something that you thought was interesting? Yes, sir. No, here, hold on a second. All right, say it again.
There were no distinction in helping somebody that was in need. Like you see someone animal was in trouble. It did not make a distinction whether you should help during the Sabbath.
The distinction made is you should help.
Yeah, but it did not say it in here. It did not show that you should help during the Sabbath.
In these laws, it didn't show that they should help?
Not to my understanding.
Yeah, let me find that exact passage there. Sorry, that was probably a fun sound for you. That's going to be in the passage where it's talking about if you see a man and his animal, and if you see a man under the burden of his animal. What passage is that? 20:22? Oh, in chapter 22. Yes. The fire gives his money. Man borrows anything from his neighbor. It's the passage where it talks about if you run across even the man who hates who you hate, and you see his I'm sorry? 23 verse 5. Yes, so 23 beginning in verses 4 and 5. So if you meet your enemy's ox or his donkey going astray, you shall bring it back to him. So if you find their animal out, you have to help them. It's not an option. And in verse 5, if you see the donkey of one who hates you lying down under its burden, you shall refrain from leaving him with it. You shall rescue it with him. So if a man has got his animal and that animal is trying to lay down under its burden or not carry it, you just can't walk away from that situation. You're required to help out with that. Yeah. That's right.
And they just push back far enough to get in and take possession of what little they needed to sustain themselves, let them commingle with them. That never was God's rule. That wasn't obeying God.
That's right.
And they suffered that.
Yeah.
All these rules, don't have any fellowship with them. Don't worship their gods. Don't, all these don'ts.
That's right. Yeah. So Bobby's comment, for those of you who couldn't hear, and especially those of you on the live stream, was that a lot of these laws are really in place because they're not going to obey those foundational principles and do the things that God told them to do. A great example is when he tells them to take the land, which we'll see here very shortly. He tells them, drive them out, and all these rules about don't have other gods and don't worship the gods of the Hittites and the Ammonites and all the other people that you're going to push out, God wouldn't have had to say that if they would have just done what they were supposed to do and push them out. But instead, he's putting all these laws in place because he already knows what they're going to mess up. Okay, that does take us to our time limit here, so we need to break here so that there's enough time for you guys to leave and the next group to come in while we're still maintaining some of that distancing. Thank you. We will have a live stream of this class on Wednesday. I doubt very seriously I will be here live streaming, and I'm probably going to try to record it from home and send it to Stuart so that you can watch that at our regular class